recording. Um, okay. We're live. My connection is trash for some reason. It has been lately. It's really upsetting. But all the same, we're live. I'm just going to quit out of a bunch of different programs to see if this helps not be a super laggy mess. The recording will turn out okay, though, which is all that really
Cool.
matters.
Right.
Because like 3 people watch it live, and a lot more people watch it on YouTube.
Yeah.
Um, let's do this thing. So, who are you?
My name is Adam Vass. I use he, him pronouns, and I am in Glendale, California, originally from the Midwest. I design games as World Champ Game Co. I feel like most people who interact with this will recognize that sooner than they'll recognize my name.
I mean, that's entirely possible. I don't know. I obviously, yes, you kind of exist as World Champ, right? Like as the top order brand. Um, but since it is like you, right? Like you've done collaborations before, and you have one going on right now. Um,
Right.
but so much of your output has been just you that I feel like your name and your brand have become synonymous.
Yeah, they're very interchangeable, and it's funny too because I think about that often. Of You'll see the conversations happen in design sphere of like, do I need a brand name or a publishing name? And I kind of wish I didn't. My game personality or like who I am in that sphere is so much more actually who I am than like my personal social media, which is filtered and like curated. I feel like the game uh, sphere is like so much more personable, and but I interact with it on behalf of this brand that is
Sure.
me.
Yeah, I mean, like I think it can be personable. It can also be vicious, but in a way, it's just kind of more raw. It's just less filtered.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and I imagine your personal like accounts, like your Twitter and all that. You're getting people not from the game space. You're getting people from like your day
Totally.
job, um, probably following you and like personal friends and things like that.
Yeah, I've got an every once in a while I'll release a game or do game promotion, and someone will tag my personal like at Adam Vass wrote this game, and then I get like 20 new tabletop people following my personal, and I it's their choice. I know that they're not going to stay.
Yeah,
I know they're not going to have a good time.
it's not the content they're probably looking for.
No.
Um, I have a feeling that I follow both your personal and your
There definitely
brand.
are people who will hang, and like I don't post there nearly as much
Yeah,
either. So it's not like obtrusive, but I feel like my personal is more for shit posting and memes and that sort of stuff, but then also for visual art or like you said, like day job stuff. So when the band has a new release or when I'm doing commission paintings and stuff, I don't like to cross streams and let the games account really like promote that aspect of my life, even though I think probably those people would be more responsive to some of the stuff.
I
Uh,
mean, yeah, and those things. So you've done game work that coincided with the music work, right? You did that.
yeah,
I'm blanking on the name. The like, I want to say it was Crystal something. I just remember the cover
yep.
was
Crystal Healing.
Crystal Healing.
So it's a compilation book of three story games that each correlate to healing crystals that were thematically important in the development. So my band is called Law Dispute. I play bass. That's my other life, I guess, not necessarily my real life, but um, and our most recent record, Panorama, has aspects of these sort of like spiritual, ethereal, um, alternative belief systems,
Okay.
and these healing crystals, which were rhodonite. and blue lace agate and rose quartz um, were sort of these pillars of design to the album and to its content, and then also extrapolated through like the merchandise and all the branding and everything that went with it. And as part of that, I designed games based on each of those crystals properties, and then we compiled them into a book, which was also a cool thing too, because we actually played them in the practice space while we were writing the record, and that was the extent of my playtesting. But it was they are they enjoy when we play games, but I'm the one who brings games to them, if that makes
Sure.
sense.
No, no, I mean,
Um,
totally. I think a lot of us have that position in our, like, daily lives.
right. But it did help people approach creative subjects in different directions that they otherwise wouldn't have, which was kind of the purpose of writing. I don't think when I wrote them, I intended to release them,
Okay.
or certainly not under the band's like merchandise
Sure.
umbrella. It was more for us to sort of like try to evaluate our own creative process because writing that record ended up being a pretty rough time for all of us, and we wrote like 8 songs and then started over. So it was just something that could like simultaneously like ease tension and kind of like get some of the pressure off and
Sure.
not think about music for a while, but then also approach these subjects that the music was circling around and help you sort of come up with an approach for it.
So, you mentioned something kind of offhandedly. Um, that is something I want to dive a little deeper into, which is, you wrote these things not necessarily knowing that you were going to publish them. That wasn't the
Yeah,
intention. Um, I think that's very different from the majority of the history of the hobby, the business, right? But as a trend that has become more and more prevalent, just doing design work for yourself. Um, you you probably, I mean, in terms of the bulk of your work, you've done a lot of like smaller games, a lot of
mhm,
kind of wide ranging topics, styles, um, micro games is probably what I'd call them.
sure.
And a lot of these things feel like deeply personal, almost like passion projects. Like I could imagine you just making this for you, and then one day just being like, well, maybe somebody else would like it. Um, is that kind of the arc of how you got involved? Like where does this come?
Definitely.
Okay,
So I, like many people, started playing D&D 3.5 with a group, and then we switched to 5, and it was um, fun. It was like passable, like we enjoyed it and we
sure.
made it our own in the way that anyone does to make it the thing that you want to do and
Mhm.
thing. But really, it was like the 6 of us or whatever becoming closer friends under this pretense, and once we started to figure out like certain players really enjoy certain aspects of this game and don't enjoy other aspects, got me into starting to do like homebrew and hacking stuff, and um, that definitely was how I got started making published games. Um, I I know the Deep Blue, which is a game that was early in my catalog.
Sure.
It's like a seafaring survival game.
Yeah.
Um, was pretty specifically designed for those friends of mine that we would play games together. Uh, One of them showed me this Twitter bot, which is called a Strange Voyage, that's
Okay.
actually implemented like into the game. So you check the Twitter feed to generate your setting or aspects of your setting. Uh, and I built it around what I interpreted everyone's collective play style. Like this game would be our game, and in it we would get to scratch like everyone's itch that they want to itch in playing role play.
Sure. I mean,
Uh, Go
even
ahead.
even that, right? Like, is still such a leap, though, right? You go from D&D. I feel like mostly there's like stages in terms
Yeah,
of like, and you just kind of jumped most of them.
yeah. I didn't do a lot of the stuff that I was doing at that time. wasn't informed by the the scene or like things that were happening in the indie space at all because I wasn't aware that such a space really existed. This is also coming from other tabletop stuff, playing competitive like strategy games.
Sure.
And I think for whatever reason that people perceive that bridge to be much longer than it is to go from strategy to role playing.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to convince people who are into board gaming to try story gaming. Um, But once I did, I just like never went back across that bridge to strategy stuff and really dove headfirst into role playing. And from making those first few games, which to some extent they're heartbreakers, they're uninformed by games
Sure.
that do similar things better. But there is sort of that purity of mind of like I'm not clouded by what mechanics are trendy or what uh, that educational foundation wasn't there.
Hmm.
And I think rather than that being a detriment to the design, it's very liberating as a creator to just be like, I made this thing. It has some bumps and bruises, and I think it's great. Like I said, it was for our group, and then I made a zine of it to give it to other people. Um, it has not done great, but like I printed it probably 3 years ago, and I printed 100 copies. There's probably still 30 or 40 copies in my closet. So in terms of my like output legacy, it's not a heavy hitter, but it perfectly accomplished what I wanted it to, and that is a success to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's this kind of general school of thought that outside of like WotC and Paizo and maybe a few other companies, like basically everyone is an outsider artist.
Mhm.
Um, but then, I think when you encounter someone who makes the leap you did or that a bunch of other people in the past few years have, I mean, like it really it shows. No, no, no. People we thought were outsider artists were still steeped in this world. Um, and what it looks like when you take somebody who has like a very low historical knowledge, but like a great surplus of creativity, is you get like really novel designs. You get things that just wouldn't have been imagined by somebody who had more experience in the space. Um, Sometimes that creates a heartbreaker, but that's fine. Like, because just as much it's going to create something that just would not even have been imaginable to someone steeped in the
Yeah.
games of the time.
Imagining trying to design that same game now with almost the burden of knowledge that I have, I would have never. It would have been a game, but it would not have been what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Like the mechanics in that are strange, and if if I made it today, I probably would have used a system that was more logical or
Sure.
intuitive. I guess is the word I want. Um, but I really like the system that is in place there. That is just whole cloth from my brain and not from studying.
Yeah, I mean, there's an element that the more you know, the more you pull your punches.
Hmm.
Right, and it's not that you're like more cautious. It's just when you don't know the force of your own creativity, there's no way to measure that. Um,
Yeah.
so what is your process like now that you do have several years of kind of insider information, getting involved in various aspects of the hobby? Like,
Yeah. So I think my process might be somewhat unique in that I am still a one person operation for the most part. So in addition to the design and writing, I'm also doing the graphic design and visual aspect
sure,
and layout for most of my projects. So that tends to inform a lot of the mechanical design choices that I make early on, the format or the medium that the game will be presented in, whether it's a pamphlet or a short zine, whether I can afford color printing or black and white. Those are actually considerations I make very, very early in the process
okay,
because if I'm going to make a game that requires color printing for whatever reason. The art like is begging to be in color. Um, it's going to cost more,
Hmm.
and I need to justify that cost with a game that's generally either longer or um, more intricate in a way that people will engage with, rather than a game like I made a game earlier this year called $1,200. It was about doing low stakes heists in quarantine. Uh, which, by the way, I just got my $1,200 last week. So I was that game was very inspired by a real personal need. But it's black and white, and I printed it at home, and it's shaped like a dollar bill, like it's 5 by 2 or something like that.
Sure.
That whole design is informed by the fact I wanted this little game to look like a $1,200 bill.
Yeah.
Obviously, not a real
Not a real
bill, but
thing, but yeah.
so in writing it and designing it, all of the mechanics had to fit. Even just like a complete thought had to fit in this 5 by 2 space, and um, so to kind of come back to it, that consideration of the final visual product, and I think this is probably something we'll get into also, but I treat almost everything I make as a print project, and I very rarely engage on this like digital only or PDF focused aspect of publishing.
Sure.
So all of that print mindedness goes into the initial design stage of what do I want this thing to be at the end. Um, a lot of that too comes from my other life of doing merchandising and branding for the band for 13 years,
Okay.
figuring out like following trends of graphic design and type and
Hmm.
print and all those things, um, and making sure things are cost effective, that you're not putting tons of hours into something that the margin is going to be super low on, are all just baked into the way I think about creative output, for better or worse. They're products, and I need to treat them in a way that is product minded.
Sure. Has Does that extend to the collaborations you've worked on?
Um, to 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 a much lesser extent.
Okay.
So a lot of the collaborative stuff, I'm very laissez-faire with, I would say, because I don't want the other people involved to be constrained in the same way that I constrain myself.
Sure.
So even currently with Necronautilus, which is
Hmm.
the game that I have on Kickstarter right now, I have contributors who are writing for this zine of expanded content, and it's different ways to interact with the game or the setting or both. And I basically just told them all, whatever makes you excited about this project, I want that to be the thing that you engage with, whether that's a standalone game in the same setting or rules that change the way that the core game is fundamentally functioning. Um, so with collaboration, and I think, hmm, how do I get back to this? Put a pin there.
Sure.
Um, I really like collaborating and having the double fuel on a fire. Um, it's inspiring to me to see what other people do with ideas that I was sort of steeping with, or um, my friend Will, who you spoke with,
Hmm.
we do a podcast called Brain Trust, and almost every week we go in with like no plan, and an hour later we have ideas for sort of functioning novel game stuff. And every time we finish recording, I can't believe we just came up with that out of thin air. But I would have never come up with those ideas on my own, even under like some direction. It is the collaborative nature. But the thing that I put a pin in, and I can't believe I remembered this. Usually when I'm on these like rants, I have to write notes down and then see what I forgot to say. A lot of the collaborative work I do, I don't know if this is a great way of doing it, but I will finish something and then give it to someone and say, like, what can you do with this? It's almost like a passive collaboration.
Sure.
Um, a lot of what's happening, the Kickstarter I did in the beginning of the year for a game called Cobwebs,
Hmm.
um, the collaborative nature of that is very passive in that I wrote the rules and made the game function, and then I passed it off and said, "What do you think you could make different about this, or make it special, or what story would you tell using this?" So it's not necessarily a back and forth or that double fuel on the fire.
Sure.
It is sort of me wanting to be the catalyst for someone else's creativity and then getting to reap the reward of engaging with that creative output that was inspired by something I made.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as like a relay race, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, the point isn't to finish the thing. The point is as to get to the part where you hand it off in the best time possible, right? To do the best job in your section. I don't know. Personally, I like that kind of collaboration. So it makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah,
Um,
it's worked really well to date too. I think it allows me to work with more people because I don't have to have as much of a time responsibility to each collaborator.
yeah,
I can just sort of put it out into the world and let things happen. Um, and because it encourages that sort of interaction, I enjoy doing it to its full extent, like having six people on something at the same time, and they're almost uh, in isolation from one another, right? Like it's this weird experiment that I'm running and see who comes up with what given the same set of tools.
sure. Um, so, how did you and Will start collaborating? Because you've worked on a few things together now.
Yeah, Will and I met at either it was either Origins or Gen Con uh 2 years ago at a Zinester like meetup trade thing. Which I think about often. One, because Will's one of my closest friends, and that was how we met. So it's just in my brain. But also, just like, how did I even end up there? Because I didn't know any of the people who took place in it. I met
Yeah,
everyone in that moment. It was just one of those things I think I saw on Twitter, and I showed up and had some zines, like.
yeah,
And uh, as you probably know, finding your people at a convention like that can be really difficult to
yeah.
say the least. And then when you do, you tend to cling to them,
Mm,
or at least I do. Um, because being at a con, I generally am so uncomfortable or feel like out of place. And the second that there's someone who I feel like I'm having a real interaction with, I want that for the whole weekend. And I think that comes back to the tabletop like board and card game
hmm.
industry is treated so much differently. It's very hustly. It's very business minded.
Yeah,
Even so, conventions, you're not there to like hang out and play. There is some aspect of friendliness there, but almost everyone is like not exploiting, but like seeing what they can get out of that
sure.
relationship.
You're
And role playing, I think there might be the understanding that it's not a career focused industry.
yeah,
So everyone's just cool and like down to help, or especially in the like indie and story game and like weirdo niche RPG stuff. I think there's that kind of communal understanding of like we're here to make art projects. Um, I often get this sort of the people in my public high school who took art classes are the kinds of people I interact with now at cons who make story games.
I mean, yeah, that's a lot of them grow up to be those people.
Yeah.
Um, no, you're completely right. This has been a big thing I've noticed over the years, like coming in on the role playing game side and then branching out and seeing what the other verticals look like. And there are people in the trad world, right? Who this is a career aspiration to do this full time, to work at one of the handful of big companies, and
Hmm.
they interact with the space very differently. But when you go to Gen Con, right, like everyone's pitching. If you're on the border card side, right, you're pitching or you're networking or you're doing something like that. Like there are people who show up and just play, but they're industry outsiders, right? Whereas like
Right.
industry insiders in RPGs, by and large, are just there to like see friends.
Hmm.
Um, like before we stopped having conventions, I would go to like 4 or 5 conventions a year, and I went just to see friends, right? Like I very rarely saw a product I was not previously aware of.
Right.
I just know the space well enough. I know the people who are going to clue me in on when something comes out. Like maybe it's the first time I've seen it in print, but like that's not what gets me excited. I'm going there because like so and so lives in Minneapolis and so lives in Canada, and I'm just not going to see them otherwise.
Yeah, there's definitely an aspect of that with like music festivals too, where you'll be in a month-long tour and all of a sudden you're doing a festival in Germany and there's 8 American bands and everyone's hanging out. Like
Yeah.
that communal aspect has definitely been a lifesaver in games. I can't think of how many times I've been at a convention or even just like at home, but in consideration of what my space in the game world is,
Yeah.
and just having those communal interactions is what like gives me life in the space and makes me want to engage with it. um but I that question initially was how I started working with Will.
Yes.
And uh after zine meetup where we traded some zines and they were games adjacent, um not everything we made then was gaming. And also it was just um I think that's even like a niche within a niche. At that time, it was before Kickstarter co-opted the word zine, and so if you were at the zine meetup, which I think ended up being like 5 or 6 people, it was because you did Zine Fest and like you traded and you were kind of already on that level in that world,
Sure.
and then engaging with games. Um, so because of that, shortly after I did um, my compilation "Wish You Were Here,"
Hmm.
and I was looking for collaborators and asked Will to help with some of that stuff. There's a game in there that I wrote that is called Time Capsule with a Demon Inside.
Hmm.
I actually don't think my version of the game is in the zine because my version of the game is literally in a time capsule in Michigan, and I remember writing it in like 4 hours to just have something in this time capsule.
Hmm.
Uh, and that in 10 years or whatever when it gets unearthed, I'm like very curious to see. I'm not sure I could find. I'm sure if I dug hard enough I could find a copy of the game in
Hmm.
my like Google Drive, but it basically just exists in this time capsule. But anyway, because it involves demons and stuff, I really wanted Will to work on it, and they did a really great job of interpreting it and making it this really strange ritual. And I think that's sort of the impetus of a lot of our game design stuff since. So a few months after we collaborated on that project, I moved from Michigan to California, where I am
Hmm.
now. And I was driving with a friend of mine. We had 2 days basically to move anything of mine that I could fit in a rented minivan, and we just drove straight through. I had my dog at the time was with us too, so we couldn't just like stop wherever
Yeah.
or take 5 days and see the country or whatever. We did this drive in 2 days, so I'm in and out of sleep in Colorado, and my friend is driving the car in the van, and Break Kickstarter had either just been announced or was like mulling around in my brain. And I texted Will this really sleepy idea of like, what if we did that? Like Kickstarter as a pre-order is already breaking Kickstarter, so to do ours as this like vaporware kind of, we want to make something but we don't know what.
Hmm.
Um, and they were into the idea, which uh, accelerated our friendship and games making relationship very quickly, because then we were it was like maybe not even a month or maybe a month after the inception of the idea that we were launching live. So
I mean, I'm still
Um,
a little surprised Kickstarter let you two get away with that.
not only did they, I feel like they actively encouraged it. Like well, they encouraged it until they didn't. Um, we had the project we love sticker like before
Mhm.
launch even, and I was like, wow, this is cool. They care. I Will reached out at the time to someone who worked at Kickstarter Union, and it was back when they were still trying to be recognized as a union.
Mhm.
And I think in doing that and having a direct conversation, they wanted to help. And then I think within we were in the first week of the Break Kickstarter event. Um, I think within a week, Kickstarter itself just stopped promoting it. Not
Mhm.
just our project, but the event as a whole.
Sure.
I because you look at something like Zine Quest, which was massive the first time and then twice as big the second time,
Yeah.
and there's almost no way like they're going to continue doing that because they can see it fosters their own success. And as I mentioned earlier, it's associating the word zine with Kickstarter, which
Mhm.
is fucked up and not real, but it works for them and it's going to make them money. So that's what they're going to keep doing. And uh, whereas there's almost no way they're not doing Break Kickstarter again.
No.
Like, I think they saw right away that there are some fun things happening here, but it's not valuable to the Kickstarter brand.
Yeah.
And so to some extent, I know I feel this way. Uh, it felt like that project got pushed off to the side or like didn't get the sort of encouragement that I was expecting. And
Sure.
because of that, it made the project extremely difficult to continue doing.
Yeah, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like that is of the Kickstarters you've run the one that took the longest to fund.
It did. It funded 2 days or 3 days before it ended.
Yeah.
And it only had a $4,500 goal, which at the time we were both like, wow, that's a lot, but we don't want to lie and say it's $1,000
Sure.
just to say that we funded, because then we'll be up shit's creek when we don't have enough money.
Yeah.
Um, so we barely crossed the finish line, but then also by the end of the campaign, if you looked at it on day one, you see Will and myself, we are game designers, trust us.
Mhm.
We're going to make a game, you just got to trust us. And we got some people, mostly people we already knew or who had already engaged with our
Mhm.
games in the past, to say, okay, I trust you, here's $20. By the end, if you looked 3 days before it ended, like the day that it funded, you see that we put in 5 weeks of active design work and came up with this really crazy novel game. And that game is something, it's definitely in like the top creative games out there in general, but definitely that I've had any hand in. And it's still, even with funding, didn't make money. It
Yeah.
because we also had budgeted at the beginning. We said we don't know what this game's going to be, but games are softcover books. They're half letter size, and we're going to print 200 games. So the budget was for 200 half letter size
Mhm.
softcover books. And what we ended up with was this box with a screen printed cloth mat and a custom like dice tower, and it's complex physically.
Yeah.
But it's gorgeous, and it ended up being this like champion design that I we both recently re-engaged with it and like read the rule book and talked about it together, almost like a post mortem. And we were both like, I can't believe we came up with this. It's great,
I mean,
especially under the duress that we put ourselves through.
yeah. I remember that campaign
It
because
was
it's,
painful.
yeah. I mean, I remember you pushing really, really hard on Twitter, doing the
Yeah,
marketing work. I remember just the updates for it were just like wild. Watching a game come together in real time, which I can't really think of any other examples of that on Kickstarter.
right.
Um, or it's like to have started essentially with nothing and to have finished the campaign with a version of product is just, it's not what Kickstarter is meant for, and so it's really
Yeah.
interesting that like it worked. Um, Okay, so then Will's Will is your most frequent collaborator,
for
right?
sure.
Um,
We still do the Brain Trust podcast. That started as like the devlog for that
yeah.
game, and then just spiraled into its own thing of us just game storming and theory crafting, and but also uh, I talk to Will more than I talk to my parents at this point. Like we text almost every day, but every Sunday we record the podcast and we talk for on the phone for 2 hours. You know, that's and most of it is design focused, but not all of it. And just like through that, that's they've become one of my best friends because of the project. But like I already admired their work before the project. It became this. It was just like a really cool, weird synergy. But yeah, that's all to say. We still work together. Will's actually one of the contributors to Necronautilus too.
Okay, I was
Um,
just about to ask that. I didn't check.
yeah, I I sometimes avoid it. I
Mhm.
try. I didn't want Will to do cobwebs stuff.
Mhm.
They are some of the one of the stretch goals I think is Will writing, but um, to some extent to me it was like not to discredit them, but the default, like, of
Mhm.
course, I'm going to ask Will every time
Sure.
because it's a proven success and every time it is awesome. So why wouldn't you? But there is a little bit of resistance on my end because it's so expected to say, like, okay, I'm going to try not to hire Will for this project. And then I tell Will and we want to work together and then
Yeah.
it happens. So yeah, they are doing some stuff with Necronautilus, which is going to be exciting.
Okay. So tell me from what's been put out there, right? The Kickstarter just dropped.
Yeah.
Um, what um, what is it?
That's a totally apt question. Um, it's a lot of things, really, because it's this design that I talked a little bit on the podcast this week about actually of I don't really remember how it started, but once it started, I couldn't stop, and then it became this thing. Because generally, I can trace back a design's origins to like, oh, I saw this movie, I want to emulate that movie,
Sure.
or I had this like visual in my imagination or whatever. This one just sort of came out. Um, so because of that, it is simultaneously a very it is what I think of the OSR, which is going back to what we talked about with Deep Blue. I'm not very informed by this.
Yeah.
So my exposure is almost exclusively UVG and Electric Bastion Land, which are
Sure.
both just like god tier tomes of knowledge and design, but also like gorgeous aesthetically and like I'm just a sucker for everything that they are.
Fair.
So I've read them and I've not played them, but I think I understand aspects of them, or at least the philosophy that went into designing them. And
Sure.
I wanted to sort of channel that philosophy myself, but with something that was more informed by. So I have this like OSR, my understanding of the OSR as like a big uh, piece of this pie. The next piece is just my consistent um, design focus on the individual,
Mhm.
on how you as a player interact and what you can learn from, or what when you walk away from the play time, do you go, oh man, that was so cool, I smashed that dude with my hammer, or like, oh, I've never thought about this thing in that way, like
Sure.
the actual power of a game. And I think this is really um, a pillar of lyric game stuff, which I dabble in, but again, am not an expert of the text itself and the game itself provoking thought in the person that interacts with it. Whether, in my case, I'm hoping more for player than just for reader,
Sure.
because it is still this gaming experience, um, informed by the sort of lyrical quality of not necessarily my work, but just of role playing. This kind of hybridization of these two trends that you can't ignore, but am engaging with them as an outsider from both of them.
Yeah, I
And I,
mean, like, sorry, just to interrupt quickly,
yeah,
I just want to point out that, like, the two quote unquote, not quote unquote, the two pretty firmly OSR titles, right? Like, Luca and Chris McDowell are both people who I would say are firmly situated within the OSR. But,
right.
like, the two titles that you've named, excellent books. Love
Oh,
them
yeah.
both. Deeply weird within the space.
Hmm.
So it's like if you picked two books from the OSR, you would be hard pressed to pick two more like edge case of the OSR
Yeah.
books.
I I have played White Hack and really loved that, and
Okay.
I do understand that there is more um, traditional focused OSR.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a thing I really thrive on from these books, well, so I guess to explain what I mean, the things that I get from OSR are things that move really quickly and sometimes procedurally.
Mm-hmm.
So especially like character creation. Oh, now that I think about it, I've also played Knave and really liked that.
Okay.
So I do have a little bit more experience than I'm leading on in OSR play. Uh, so this sort of like procedure and like lightning fast ability of
Mm-hmm.
running and playing is something that was paramount to me, and also this really the focus on player skill versus character skill, which is something I didn't really understand. I remember um, when I first learned about Mothership and Sean McCoy
Mm-hmm.
told me that, and I didn't understand. And he says, if I'm playing a mystery game, I want to solve the mystery. I don't want my detective character to roll good and then be told the solution. And I'm like, okay, I kind of get that, but like um, now much deeper into my understanding of games and making games, I understand and value that much more highly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's space for it in indie and story stuff that people aren't taking,
Mm-hmm.
because so much of story stuff is almost like letting go of the wheel and seeing what happens with this collective uh, brain working together to tell this story. So it's much less about what you do as an individual player, and it's more about where your character ends up in the narrative arc. So from OSR, I took this. I want me to be able to be creative. I want
Sure.
so as such, an aspect of the game is there is no spell list, there is no skill list,
Okay.
there are no attributes. The only stats you have are words that you come up with.
Okay.
And so
It's very
if I
fate esque.
yeah, I there will be a selection of words in the book that are like thematic or inspiring or otherwise like suggested,
Okay.
but really you could use anything. And so on the Kickstarter page, an example I use is visionary,
Mm-hmm.
and so this was also from playing White Hack and coming up with your own spells, and then convincing the game master that your spell can do this because the name.
Mm-hmm.
That's really the core function of Necronautilus is if I'm a visionary, I can see the future. And
Mm-hmm.
the GM's like, yes, sure, that sounds
That
cool. But
works.
also, like, I can see through this wall, or I can see um, what probability and like which of our decisions will be the right one or whatever. So there's this aspect of a thing I focus on in the design and in the marketing of the game, the subjectivity of language. What does this word mean to you in this moment? Um, and that's something I want players to walk away from. I never thought this could mean that.
Okay.
Uh, but through play, there's also this the words that you collect aren't just your so in the case I just gave, they're called words of power. So those are
Okay.
your skills, your spells, anything you physically do.
Sure.
But you can also offer words in this sort of like instant procedural generation of new planets and new people and like monsters and stuff. So they're
Mm-hmm.
almost like an ad lib where the GM will say like, okay, you want to go to this planet. I need a word from this player. I need a word from that player. And so they offer, like vacuous and cannibal. And it's like, okay, well, so now you're going to this vacuous planet full of cannibals, or are you going to a cannibal planet full of vacuous people.
Yeah,
And what does any of that mean? Um, Different people will infer different meanings from it, and
totally.
so everyone's planet, all the people who live on each planet, they're all going to be, I wouldn't call it random. They're going to be informed by what your group infers. The whole
Sure.
game is this Rorschach test all the way down of what does this mean to you and how do you choose to engage with it because of that inferred meaning.
I like how you started by saying it's your version of the OSR, and we've just gone like so far. I mean, it sounds fascinating. It's just a very interesting way to arrive at the description.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
I took this OSR theory that I really enjoyed reading about and like engaging with as a passive reader, and took away the things that I thought would impede that creative ideology,
sure.
which are numbers and um, not necessarily lore, because I would say that there is like subjective lore in
Mm-hmm.
the book. There are characters like Death or Satan who are in the book, but like not necessarily there's no history. You don't have to play them
Sure.
in a particular way or anything like that. So I thought that, if your spell only works from 30 feet away or something like that, like all of a sudden you have these other things that are going to inhibit those exceptionally creative player moments. And I want to take away all those inhibitions and just let players go buck wild with words.
Sure. I mean, so I think, correct me if you do not feel this way, but something that I personally have observed as a through line of your work is the rejection of the importance of numeracy, right? Just like getting away from numbers as the baseline for playing pretend. Um, which isn't to say that like you're going completely diceless, right? Like not every
Right.
game that you make is amber diceless or whatever. But you don't prioritize that type of mechanistic play in your rules, whatever the rule system is per game.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the exceptions are when I use existing systems,
Sure.
if I make it like a PBTA thing. I do think probability works its way into a lot of my design stuff, in a way that I think might be invisible to the player. So with something like Guide, where we have cards that have symbols on them,
Mm-hmm.
and you get to use a number of symbols to generate your scene. And then again, like there's this subjectivity to what is this symbol? How do you spin it into the scene?
Sure.
Um, there's there's this aspect in the design of how many symbols go on each card and what is the likelihood that any two cards are going to be adjacent
Sure.
through play. So, if you have a skull on one card and a casket on another card, um, in what way can you sequence them among other symbols so that they aren't inherently paired,
Yeah.
right? So I think probability. It I actually so when I was younger and in college, I aspired to be like a math major. Like
Really.
I was in like late calculus. I really thrived in math and have kind of stayed good at it. More I think that's also really rare for like what is it, left-minded or creative people,
Mm-hmm.
to have not just like understanding of, but like appreciation of these other not
Sure.
creative things. I don't know that math is inherently not creative, but I'm on like a deep tangent now. So I studied
Please
math a
keep
lot.
going.
I studied math a lot, and I really liked that. I was exceptionally good at it. I was the person who would ruin the grading curve because I would get every answer right, and
Sure.
the the teacher would be like, "Okay, well, it's just out of his score now, so have like everyone would get a worse grade because of me." Um, so there is this invisible integration of math and numbers into my games, but they almost never reach the player. And I think that's important to me because one, I know people don't like math. Um, from having that been an important aspect of my younger life and telling people that and getting their reactions, Or even just like, when you're in high school math and someone's like, when are we ever gonna use this? Like, just the attitude people have over numbers and
Hmm.
calculations and stuff is negative. So how can I reduce that? It comes to a thing that I think happens a lot in game design of what does this feel like to engage as a player? Like
Sure.
that's why D6 pools feel awesome because you just roll a bunch of dice. It's
Yeah.
about the feeling that you have a tactile thing and the sound and all of it. So doing math has never been that, right? If you roll a d20 and then you add your modifier and you need to beat this score, that all is the procedural, not fun aspect of swinging your sword at a goblin.
Yeah.
So, how can I then consider the probability that your sword will hit, but reduce the math or maybe eliminate the math and just hide it in a way that you can still be um, surprised or engaged by the game in a way that feels intuitive as a player?
I'm sorry about my dog
It's
going crazy behind me.
okay.
Um, okay, back to the conversation.
Sure.
Um, so I'd say that all makes sense, except that clearly as a common trend throughout the history of the hobby, right? Like, is this deep well of numeracy as an enjoyable aspect? Not something I've ever particularly enjoyed. It's why I'm really excited for games that either background that stuff or do away with it entirely. But a lot of people do love it, right? And to use your high school math example, right? I feel like RPG designers have, for the majority of the time, not been the people who go, when am I going to use it, but are the people who enjoy it.
Hmm.
It is a really interesting trend away from that, but it's also very surprising that you're someone who has this appreciation of it and the technical skill at it, and yet your designs either background it or kind of elide it. Um, is that just so you say? I have no reason not to believe you that it's about kind of getting to the way the thing feels, to skipping the unnecessary step. Um, but is that out of your own feelings at the table, being a player, going back to when you were just playing D&D? Is that a consideration for individuals who do not share your joy of math? Where does that view emerge from? Because I could very easily see a person liking this stuff and then incorporating it into their design. That seems to be more reasonable to me.
Yeah. I think if I were not pressed, I would not have considered that an answer. Like,
Sure.
if you didn't ask, I would have never thought about what the answer is. Uh, I think I do enjoy a degree of uh, tactics and integration of, having the battle map out and say, like, I can move 30 feet in 6 seconds and do all that is fun to me in some settings. I think a reason I ignore it in a lot of my own design circles back to what I said about designing for my play group, which I think is different than designing for myself.
Sure.
Um, so, especially again, when I talked about teaching, writing games to play with the band, those were like no numbers. I think
Mm-hmm.
only one of them has dice and you only roll them at the end.
Okay.
So, that is to engage with people who don't have the gaming baggage and
Sure.
also like I want to hit the ground running. Like we wrote those games, we played those games to elicit a very particular response, and anything that got in the way of that or made you think about something else and like diverted your attention would inhibit the game's efficacy to do the thing I wanted to do.
Sure.
So I think a lot of the probability stuff and design stuff I enjoy working on my own in the background, even just like looking at dice probabilities and seeing what system I want to integrate into a particular design to suit a particular like a chance of something happening. I enjoy engaging with on an individual designer level, but I am well, I was going to say considerate. I think literally I am considering. I don't think
Sure.
it necessarily means I'm being kind and considerate.
Yeah, I mean,
For the
literally
player,
without the baggage of the
right?
word considerate. Yeah.
I am considering during design what it feels like to be one of the five people in my core game group who doesn't want to do those things or who thrives really well on like character creation or statless games where you can just dive into your character or the world or some facet of the design that isn't odds based or stat based.
Mhm.
And I want to keep making games because I enjoy so much playing that style with those people. More than making a game for myself, I'm making a game for myself plus four, the
Sure.
people who I want to engage with. And um I do like numbery stuff. On solo. A lot of solo stuff like journaling, despite
Mhm.
having made a letter writing solo game, doesn't en- doesn't engage me a whole ton because despite everything I said about Necronautilus, it's only very recently that I considered myself capable with words, versus I have considered myself a visual person, both as a artist, a creator, and also someone who engages with like visual medium better than words and language. Um, I think only recently did I accept the fact that I'm writing books now
Yeah,
as
it
role
was
playing
like
games.
picked a weird hobby to get involved with if you're
Yeah,
not good at words. Um,
I've made myself appreciate them in new ways through having to write them.
Fair. I
Um,
mean, that'll happen.
yeah.
um, okay. So, I'm just trying to think. There are a few things you've said that I feel are worth diving into further. I'm
Cool.
just trying to figure out which is going to be the most interesting. Okay, so you know what? The most top of my mind is the journaling one, right? That's
Mhm.
a big trend.
Yeah.
Both solo RPGs and kind of journaling RPGs or epistolary RPGs when you incorporate another individual. Or like I think I don't know, maybe they exist somewhere in the historical record, but like as like a weird little thing that somebody created. But like I'm pretty much I don't think I've encountered them prior to like 2010. Like
Hmm.
just flat out, it's a novel thing. It's new. Um, I likewise I find them fascinating. I don't like them. Like I would much rather play 4E than a journaling game pretty much any day of the week. I find 4E less conceptually interesting as like an object of study, but I find it a hell of a lot more fun. Um, that's just me. That's me like it, you being someone who enjoys strategy and does not
Hmm.
in any way mind the math, but also understands that it's not for everyone, and that there is a place for these other types of games.
Hmm.
Um, I don't. I don't even say I don't. I am not as considerate an individual as you seem to be. Just categorically. It's just not a thing that interests me terribly much. Um, and so for me, it's a very interesting way of thinking about design, right? I've always kind of framed design as design for the market or design for the self. Um, and those you can go back and forth between those.
Hmm.
Um, but I find designers in RPGs specifically tend to kind of go one or the other primarily. But to it's not that you're sitting between them, it's that you are positing an entirely third category of design for close friends. Design for the other, but the other writ small. Um, does so this this ended up a different way than where I started speaking.
Sure.
Um, is this a factor of who you've surrounded yourself with, of who you made friends with, right? If you hadn't gone to that Gen Con or Origin zine meetup, if you hadn't met Will and become as close as you are with them, do you think this consideration for the other as a primary thrust of your design work, of your design philosophy, would have led you somewhere else? And is that a thing that you could see changing in the future, right? Is the work that you're producing now just right now, Adam? And 5 years from now, Adam is vastly different? Or have you found a type of design that feels like it is authentically you?
Um, so I think it's the latter. I think my design is my design at this stage. I think
Okay.
I'm really good at. So I think if those things didn't happen, if I didn't find my people and I didn't interact with the community in the way that I have come to interact with,
Mm-hmm.
I I definitely would have quit by now, because I wouldn't have received any level of encouragement
Yeah.
that I think is necessary to want to do something so difficult.
Yeah.
Um, but also, I think I would have, in the time that I spent in the game world before tapping out, tried to shift to more commercially minded or just like product based, not necessarily product based, but lowest common denominator, wider
Sure.
audience stuff, fantasy, probably whatever, which has never really been my bag, and I think that's part of the thing for me to go in this other direction is medieval fantasy does next to nothing for me.
Okay.
So I think that was already an aspect of the design that sent me on the trajectory that I'm on.
Sure.
Um, but yeah, doing that would have felt very vapid. And as we mentioned earlier, very few people make this thing their career. And if I'm putting the amount of time and consideration and studying and writing and design that I do now to make $200 a month on Patreon, there's if I didn't like the stuff I was making, if I was
Yeah.
making fantasy stuff, I would have burnt out almost immediately and would have probably never played games again. Um, so that is certainly the case that the things that I'm making, the style that I'm doing, the design information that I have and have curated through that um, desire to create for the people close to me is what makes my thing. It is
Sure.
what makes my work special. Um, that said, through that journey of understanding, and I think making games and seeing the way that people interact with them, or which ones work and which ones don't, or how efficient or effective I am at doing the thing that I aspire to, helps me understand people better, specifically the people I want to be close to, the people I want to engage with, which becomes this cycle of now I know these people and I design for with them in mind, but that whether it's well, whether it's by you know tyranny of will to keep publishing work or being an active member of the community or whatever, I have a sustainable, good sized, reliable, trustworthy audience. And so my design focus is sharpened by those considerations to the extent that they're not always active anymore. They're not, I'm going to bring this to this group of people on Wednesday and I want to make sure that they have a good time. It's just the stuff that I make is informed by the stuff that I've made, the experiences I've had. Everything is
Sure.
learning and cumulative. So at this stage, I've gotten exceptionally good at blending those past considerations with my current design goals and trends and like things I want to do. So I'm working on. In addition to Necronautilus, I still have a Patreon and I still try to put something out every month. Uh, I'm working on a game that's inspired by The Evil Dead because I went to
Cool.
the drive-in last week and saw The Evil Dead and it was sick. like,
It's a fucking great movie.
yeah. So I'm working on that, but it's not just like battling these deadites, right? It's not Ash versus Evil Dead. It is this like asymmetrical GM-less way of engaging with the world that Evil Dead supposes.
Okay.
And so I think it's a really good example of my design education coming from not even necessarily design itself, but from the people that I've met and made friends with and cared about along my design journey. That's what informs my current design, and I can with very little effort marry those considerations to themes and styles and settings and tones and stuff that I want to pursue as just like a fan of things. I think Cobwebs is a really good example of that because I really love these like mini series serial fiction podcasts. Cobwebs is explicitly like Limetown, the podcast,
Yeah.
the game. Um, I've gotten really good at engaging with a form of media that I like and being able to distill it into core functions and then mapping those functions to games. Um, but those functions themselves are informed by just like greater games education and the people that I care about. So um, in doing what I would consider to be genuine work that is also good, I have accrued an audience that appreciates the genuine work that is usually also good. So um, it became this really self-serving cycle. But
Sure, it's a feedback
so,
loop.
exactly. So now the games I make are considerate of people I don't know, but I know people like them,
Yeah.
right? Like it's still a thought. And if you like really any of my stuff, there the bridge to something else I've made is not too far, and I think then you end up they all the audience, the people I engage with my work, also end up in this feedback loop of appreciating the work either thematically, visually, design wise, whatever,
I mean,
mechanically.
I can certainly attest to that. Your games simultaneously are very, very different, but you can tell, like, okay, if I like 3 out of 4 that I play, the odds are I'm going to find another within the oeuvre, right, of
Mm-hmm.
work that is going to hit the same notes. And it'll hit them in a different way, right? It's not that they're just a replication of the mechanics in a different setting or something.
Right.
But they feel like the work of the same individual.
Yeah, and that's a compliment to me, right? Like it is obviously the same work, but I want myself in that work.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw someone tweet at me last night about Necronautilus and like sharing screenshots from the Kickstarter page. And it made me realize this sort of duality that I've been striving for and what this game really feels like a thesis on my design career
Okay.
of wanting to make exceptionally cool shit and just like skulls that bleed motor oil and like just fucking cool with things that are really sincere and deliberate and like force the player to care about something.
I
and,
mean,
and I think that's to boil down like almost everything I've made in the last 3 or 4 years. That's what I want to be.
yeah. I mean, and most of the time you are very successful at marrying those two. Um, okay, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Like, go back Necronautilus. It looks
Yeah,
rad.
it's tinyurl.com/space champ because I wanted a URL that I could tell people or that wouldn't require them to spell
Yeah.
Necronautilus.
I like it. World champ becomes space champ.
Yeah,
Um, this is good. I can't believe this is the first time we're speaking.
right.
Um, so weird. It's like I've followed your stuff for several years now. We've had like lengthy discussions online, and I had like no idea what you sounded like. Um,
Right. It's one of those things that I mentioned earlier too. Like when you find your people, that web kind of grows out, right? Like a friend of a friend is your friend,
Pretty much.
especially in this world. And I also find there are all these like Venn diagram niches, like especially people my age who like underground music are
Sure.
people that I generally get even closer to than just like we like the same games, right? So any kind of alternative upbringing, I feel like will liken me to you.
Yeah. Same. I could not. We are an island of misfit toys,
Right.
and it's just like so long as your damages line up, you're gonna be good friends. And
Yeah.
in this hobby, a lot of times they do. Um, anyway, dude, it was a pleasure.
Likewise.
Thank you. I hope Necronautos is already doing very, very well in the funding arena, so I can
Yeah.
imagine it's just gonna keep on going up. Yeah, that's it.
Great.
Peace.